Hey everyone, welcome back to another Worth a Second Chance community check-in. Today I'm joined by Genevieve Higgins. Thank you so much for joining me, Genevieve.
No problem. How are you going?
Good, how are you?
I'm good, I'm good.
Good.
Probably the best place to start is letting you know, I guess, who I am and what I do. So I'm the
Fantastic.
manager of community justice programs at Jesuit Social Services, and that includes managing and supporting the program Youth Justice Group Conferencing, which is what I'm here to talk about for you all today.
Awesome, thank you for that little intro. So I have three key questions for you. They're kind of broad and big. We just discussed them before, but we're going to do our best, or you're going to do your best. You're going to do all the work, but answer them in a short period of time, but they're pretty broad. So the first one I'm just going to jump into is, could you explain to us what group conferencing is and how it works?
Yeah, sure. So Youth Justice Group Conferencing is a program and a process where we work with young people who've committed an offence in the community to, I guess, develop their insight and understanding around the harm that they've caused. And what that involves is preparing them to participate in a process where we're also inviting the person who's been directly harmed by what's happened, supports and others who've been affected by what's happened, because as you can imagine, when there's an offence or any crime that's been committed, the impacts of those have a significant ripple effect across people's lives, families and communities. So essentially what you end up with is a process where you've got the young person, people who've been harmed, supports, community members, a range of people in the room talking about what's happened, how people have been affected, and how we can get together as a collective with a shared understanding around what's happened and come up with a plan that's going to, I guess, repair the harm that's been caused, support that young person to flourish, help in the healing for those who've been impacted, and really to promote the well-being of all those in the room moving forward. So that's essentially what we're trying to do when we facilitate a Youth Justice Group Conference.
That's really incredible. And as you're saying that, everything you said, you're like, that makes so much sense. Of course you would approach justice in this way, but group conferencing, from my understanding, is at the moment it's opt-in as opposed to opt-out, which means that it's not compulsory, it's something that's optional and available to young people. And so in contrast, the traditional, what are the biggest key differences, maybe just expand a little bit more, than a young person going into a traditional like courtroom versus group conferencing?
Oh, for sure. I mean, really what we're talking about is getting people in the room to firstly understand what's happened. It's important that we have courts and we have these processes. It's very important that justice is served, that people feel like that there's been a response, from, I guess, our judiciary, and from which is often mirroring community values. But what a court often doesn't get to establish is really that narrative, that story, those underlying challenges that precipitate the behaviour. And so what we're trying to do is by bringing everyone into a room to talk about that stuff, we can achieve a lot more healing as opposed to just the sort of punishment response. So if I can take an example in that, I've worked alongside victims and young people for 10 years doing this work. And often young people who commit offences are victims themselves. And what I find with young people and victims right off the bat is what they're actually interested in is, first of all, I want to understand. And secondly, I want to be a part of the solution. I want to help. So when we're talking about people who've been harmed and we talk about a courtroom process, sometimes their voices actually aren't as present. They're not able to be involved in the decision making. But in a group conference, people who've been harmed can sit there and say, well, actually, I think that this might be the way forward. Actually, I recognise what's happened to you in your life is similar to me, and maybe these are the ideas that may help. Or in other conferences I've been a part of, victims saying, mate, I'll give you a job. you know. So that need to be a part of the solution is also really real for people who've been harmed, and is often what's missing in a courtroom setting, is that actual engagement in the solution to move forward and flourish. So that to me would be a clear distinction.
Absolutely. And as you were talking as well, I was thinking about often when we are the victim of some kind of crime, I think one of the worst things is the power being taken away from us. And I think that can hurt the most sometimes, people being left powerless, but being involved in that process, being able to help to understand and then have influence and power in reclaiming your story, that person's story, like moving forward, I imagine can be really healing for both parties. And sounds like a really incredible holistic approach.
And well, that's exactly right. What we're trying to achieve by getting in a room and having these conversations about what happened and who's been affected and how we can improve things is you've got to also get the right people in the room. And that's another thing that's a challenge with courts. There's an ingredient, there's an actual sort of recipe for the right people in a room. And we talk a lot about those that will give insight. So the what happened, the impacts, the story. We want those who can give support, because it's a difficult process to ask a child or anyone who's been harmed to talk about these things, to really talk about your feelings. Yes, there's actions. Yes, there are thoughts, but we're talking about how we feel. And it can be a very emotional and challenging experience. So we need support in the room. And then we need those who will carry the plan and the momentum and the energy and the insights from that experience. We need the oversight. We need those that will carry that forward so that young people can flourish, that healing can continue, that people then also understand, like, I get it now, the full picture is there. Because what we find in telling a story, if you're only telling your own, you're always going to be missing pieces. What people want is to be able to join the dots. And so when you get all those people in the room who will offer insight, support, and oversight, all those little parts of that story will be filled. Everyone's contributing to that story. So it's full, it's clear. There's a real complete narrative. And what we talk about in group conferencing is we want to get to a point where there is a shared understanding, a shared picture of what happened, who's been affected, and the ideas on the page of how we can make things better. So these are the things that we think about when we prepare and run a process. It's about people in the room. It's not just about the facilitation and the questions, but you've got to have the right ingredients. And there's a high degree of preparation that goes into that as well. It's very careful, very considered. We want to ensure that it's safe, and especially for vulnerable young people and victims of crime. So all these things need to go into making a process run really well and is effective.
Amazing. It sounds like an incredible amount of work leading up to, in the room, and then afterwards as well, and a lot of careful thought going into it. But I think what I love the most about it is you're looking at everyone's stories and each person as the whole person, which is often missing in a courtroom from my experience. So that's really, really wonderful. Yeah, my next question is for you is around restorative justice. So a lot of what we've been talking about would come under that umbrella of restorative justice in the context of group conferencing. I was wondering if you could speak to that term a little bit, because it's something that we hear a lot, but it is quite broad as well. So to the best of your ability, short time we have, I know it's a big question, but would you
and look, I think a lot of what I've shared is part of that. We are leading with our principles. Our first principles are, we do no further harm. We want to reset and restore the right relationships. And we want to work with people, not do things to or for them. We want to work with. Now, we start with those three, and everything that comes from that, I guess, is what develops the process, is what goes into the process. But we start with our principles, and that's really important. Restorative justice in terms of group conferencing is a process where we're talking about, and again, I'll say it's about looking at what's happened and who's been affected and how we can make things better. And where I'm going to go to the value that I talked about around resetting and restoring relationships, the word restore. It's restorative justice. The word restore is central to that. What are we talking about? We're talking about when someone causes harm or where there's been an impact around an offence, what happens? Relationships break down. Conflict occurs. For young people, it has an impact on their family members. You can imagine that that trust is broken, that those connections are frayed in some way. There's community impacts. If the offending is happening in a school, if someone's gone into a school and caused damage, the community impact is enormous. And there's broken relationships in that context as well. Mm. So when we're talking about restoring or restorative justice, we're talking about getting into a room to have a conversation to reset this stuff. Mm. And how do we reset? We try and get that understanding around what's happened, and we explore what are the underlying issues and challenges that have brought about this issue for us to understand and therefore have, I guess, ideas to, I guess, intervene somehow. Mm. So that's restorative justice. It's about looking at who do we need in the room to kind of reset and restore the relationship. What relationships do we actually need to establish? You know, we're going to find that kids come in there and go, I was really substance affected on that night when I did this really heinous thing, but I don't have any supports in place in order to address these really serious issues. So in that room, we can acknowledge that and go, well, what do you need? What can we put in place? So that's establishing. There might be issues around relationships that actually need to be terminated. This is all part of it. You know, you're going to hear young people saying, I went along with the crowd. I know these guys are bad. I know that this is not something I should be doing, but I went along with it and I was a bit gutless or powerless, or I felt like I had no power. So talking in the conference about that, it might be, are these really the kind of friendships that you need in your life? Mm-hmm. Are these the relationships that are going to help you to flourish, especially when you've acknowledged that they aren't good for you? So is that something that needs to be terminated? Mm-hmm. Do you need to explore how you might be able to distance yourself from that and establish some relationships with people who are more supportive and caring? So you can see that we're talking about a whole range of things in terms of relationship management as well. Mm. So restorative justice is everything that I've explained. It's a process from preparation to the facilitation to follow-up. And all of those have key aspects that are from those principles above that are important, and they can't be isolated. They all work together seamlessly to, I guess, develop a really positive outcome for young people and those that have been harmed.
Oh, thank you. That was a really wonderful way to frame restorative justice. And I love those 3 values that you're operating under. They're just perfect. And it's just dawning on me now, of course we know how important relationships are, but it just seems to be this really central theme of the work that you do in that room is just all about relationships. And of course, if it makes sense, like if we don't have those people to support us, or if we don't have even the space to discuss these kind of things, like the young people that I work with in the past that have been in contact with the justice system don't have the people in their lives to be facilitating those kind of conversations, to get that kind of reflection happening, to make the connections that then lead to the change. If there's no space for that, there's no growth and leading to a positive.
And it's interesting because you can't do that unless it's safe. You know, it's got to be a really safe place because, you know, we've got young people talking for the first time about a whole range of things, often in front of family members, hearing it for the first time perhaps.
Wow.
So there's a high degree of vulnerability in that room.
Absolutely. Vulnerability was the other thing I was thinking about, for young people to show up, to admit to what they've done and to open up that discussion and reflect, because from my experience, that is a really hard thing for them to do. It's a hard thing for anyone to do. But when you haven't had practice and you haven't had people in your life that are giving you that space and saying it's safe. So I can't imagine the kind of work that goes into preparing that kind of safe space for them, that they feel confident enough and safe enough to open up. It's really incredible.
And it's, you know, harking back to the preparation, you're right. I mean, a lot goes into prep. You can't walk in a room and have these conversations straight away. It takes time, and it's equitable. You know, you're going to get some young people who really get it straight away and understand and are comfortable quite quickly. But you might have a person who's been harmed, a victim of crime, or even another family member who will need a lot more time invested in supporting them to be part of the process. So it's different every time who you need to sort of attend to and what you need to attend to. So that changes a lot.
Having that flexibility must be so important.
Yeah.
Which
and there's always going to be things you can't prepare for everything, and nor should you. It's really important in a group conference that it's also people feel safe enough to go, oh, I'm angry, I'm pissed off, and I want to talk about it. Like, we don't want to turn down people's emotions. Obviously, you've got to conduct yourself respectfully, and we prepare for all of that. But people are allowed to express their emotions. That's the whole point. It's meant to be a transformative experience. We need to be able to travel through this feeling angry, but then all of a sudden feeling curious. Really? I never heard that before. What do you mean? And then maybe interested, leaning in even further. That's such a surprising insight now for me, to the point where we're all interested together. We've hit a shared sort of picture. Actually, I'm feeling really uplifted and hopeful, and I'm actually interested in enjoying this, because now I feel like there's something that we can all do together. That's just it really is an affect type process experience. It really travels you. You are guided through a whole range of feelings. We want to get to a point at the end where people are feeling some interest and hope.
Absolutely. Just out of interest, how many sort of facilitators do you have in a room, or do you use the word facilitator? I'm not sure.
Well, it depends. Usually we have one convener for a youth justice group conference, but if it's really complex, we can have co-conveners, and that role may look slightly different. There might be one who sort of leads the conversation, and the co-convener may be someone who is scanning the room and observing a range of things, but maybe jumping in to clarify or perhaps pick up on things that may have been missed. They might assist more in the negotiation part of the conference, where we're coming up with ideas for an outcome plan. They may be more involved in that way. But it's usually one convener, but two if it's really complex and it requires more eyes and more support for the convener, the lead convener. Yeah.
Makes sense. I could talk to you about this forever, but we're gonna get sidetracked. So my last question for you is, would you be able to share with us a positive outcome that has come from group conferencing, anonymously of course, but if there's one that comes to mind or you're quite fond of?
I've always got one. There's always one or two in your mind, and I'm just picking which one it is. It's I'm just thinking about what you guys out there would be interested in. I had a conference where there was a young woman who had got, obliterated in the city drinking, but she was also a type 1 diabetic and was having a hypo at the time. We know that alcohol can have a significant impact on your insulin and levels and a range of other things. And it was broad daylight, and 3 police officers attended because it was quite disruptive. And she really kicked off. And part of that was complicated by her diabetes. And she bit a member and spat in their face. And she also kicked another member in the stomach. She was really distressed when she was held in the jail cell at the police station. For her also, she remembers that experience being like she was asking, I need my insulin. And they just sort of, for a better word, they said she was just feral. We didn't know what to do, but we also just were trying to attend to her needs, but it was really difficult. And also we were hurt. We were feeling very distressed about our members. So long story short, we ran a conference, and 2 members who were assaulted on that day came, as well as the informant for the matter, so a colleague, but also the informant, the person who investigated the case. The young person came with her mum and another support person. And it was interesting for her. She was really interested in being able to talk to them about how she was as a diabetic and how she felt like she was dealt with quite heavy-handedly at the station, and it was quite upsetting to her. But what she didn't understand is that her actions to those members had caused significant distress and harm. So for the member who was bitten and spat on, he had to have blood tests, go through bloodborne virus procedures, and he'd just had a baby. His wife had just had a baby. And he talked about how he was too scared to touch his daughter. He couldn't hold her. He couldn't nurse her. He felt too scared to be with his wife intimately, and even became quite emotionally distant and was very distressed. For the woman who was kicked in the stomach, she was pregnant at the time. So after that, she went straight into emergency to make sure that her unborn baby was okay. So for these two officers, being able to share that experience for them, which was really difficult for them to be vulnerable, but they knew they needed to do this for themselves, but also for this young person, was one of the most moving conferences I've been a part of. And for the young woman who had done what she'd done, it's important to know she doesn't know what she doesn't know. And for her to hear that in the room, she really connected with them. She was so deeply apologetic and talked about her own younger sister, and she's about 10 or 15 years older than her little sister. She talked about how she remembered her mum being pregnant when she was young, and it was actually quite distressing for her to know that she'd done that, but she wouldn't have known otherwise. But it gave her pause to think about things. She also got an answer around how she was being treated at the police station, and they were really candid about it. They said, "You'd really hurt one of our own, and we didn't feel a lot of empathy for you. It was hard to care about your needs. And although we needed to do better, because we understand that you've got diabetes, and we ended up getting, the insulin in and doing all the right things, we emotionally couldn't connect with you because we knew that our members were hurt, and particularly the woman who was pregnant. They all knew that she was pregnant." So they were able to say, "You've got to understand we're just people too. And we can always do better, but we couldn't on that occasion give you more than we could because we were so angry and upset. So in some ways we tried to disengage from you as much as possible." The mum was able to talk about showed real gratefulness and gratitude for the members to be able to talk about that stuff, but also how proud she was of her daughter to be able to front up and accept this and hopefully take on board the lessons and insights from that conversation. And actually the outcome plan, which was already in some ways in place, this young woman was going to school, needing to manage her health. Everyone in that room said, "The outcome plan is this conference. This is enough for us. You just need to go and have a good life, manage your health, be a good person, and we need to go away and heal. And maybe if we come across each other in the street," because these guys knew her in the community, it'd be nice just to say hello and see how you are and get an update on your life. But this is enough for us. So that's a really memorable conference for me that shows, the way that things are reset, established, understood, and how people can walk away from that feeling some healing and some understanding on what happened.
Oh, that's really beautiful. It sounds a really special thing to be a part of, but to be able to have both sides delve into the humanness and the impacts, because it is so easy to see a police officer as a police officer and not think about their lives or them as a person and
a father, a mother, a brother, a sister, everything. Yeah. And for
and
them to see a young woman as not how she was in the city that time, but as a young woman going to school with hopes, with dreams, who cares about her little sister, that wants to do better, that doesn't define who she is. So it was really important.
And for them to recognize that for her, so then she can move forward. It's just all so important and such an excellent opportunity. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
That's all right.
I think that's a beautiful way to end it. But thank you for your time. I really enjoyed learning a lot more about group conferencing, and I'm sure whoever's watched this video has felt the same way. So thank you, Genevieve.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.